Hello, friends. Today is not only July 17th, but also the observance of Shiva Asarbitamus, the 17th of Tammuz. And I say the observance because actually, if you are tracking the Hebrew date, today is actually the 18th of Tammuz, but these fast days are never observed on Shabbat. So when they fall on Shabbat, their observance is deferred a day to the next day. So just as Shiva Asarbitamus, the 17th of Tammuz, is actually being observed on Sunday, on the 18th, in 3 weeks, Tishrei B'Av, the 9th of Av, is going to fall on Shabbat, and we never observe that on Shabbat. So that fast day too will be deferred until the next day. So this is, for all practical purposes, the beginning of the 3 weeks, which we're going to dig into what that actually means, mythically, historically, and to the extent that those of us here are interested, a little bit practically, although I can point you in other directions if you really want to get deep into the practical halacha, the laws of this time of year. As we'll see, this day could be thought of as beginning a season or continuing a season that started on Shavuot and lasts all the way through the days of Yom Kippur. So understanding ourselves to be tied deeply into a sort of cosmic time cycle that is not just this day and not even just these 3 weeks, but is much broader for our people. We'll jump into how that works. I'm putting the source sheet that I've created, and I don't expect we will manage to get through all the sources today, into the chat for those who want to download it or those who want to click on the link and go through it at your own pace. But I'll also screen share as we study together. So let's start making the blessing for Torah study. And you're welcome to make whichever form of the blessing. The first version is in the traditional masculine God language. The second version is in the non-binary Hebrew project language. And the third version is in feminine God language for studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Brucha at ya Eloheinu ruach haolam asher kerabatnu la'avodatav v'tzivatnu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the source by whatever names and pronouns we use, who connects us to holiness through the opportunity of studying Torah. All right, so our proof for thinking about this time as a unit of time shows up in the Mishnah in Masechet Ta'anit. So the Mishnah is the earliest layer of Jewish oral law, probably discussed for starting about 2,000 years ago. And Masechet Ta'anit, Tractate Ta'anit, is the tractate that deals with fasts. So you would think it makes a lot of sense for it to deal with these fast days, but actually most of Tractate Ta'anit deals with the, not with liturgical fasts, but with the fasts that the Beit Din, that the rabbinic court would decree on the people, particularly in times of drought or in other times of danger. Fasts were a spiritual technology for in dire circumstances for overcoming those circumstances. And it's only towards the fourth and last chapter of Mishnah Ta'anit that they start talking about scheduled fasts. And it's in this context that they discuss this period of time that we will come to call the 3 weeks. So can I have a volunteer who is willing to read the translation of the Mishnah?
I'll read it.
Thanks, Janine.
The Mishnah discusses the 5 major communal fast days. 5 calamitous matters occurred to our forefathers on the 17th of Tammuz, and 5 other disasters happened on the 9th of Av. On the 17th of Tammuz, the tablets were broken by Moses when he saw that the Jews had made the golden calf. The daily offering was nullified by the Roman authorities and was never sacrificed again. The city walls of Jerusalem were breached. The general Asarbitamus publicly burned a Torah scroll, and Manasseh placed an idol in the sanctuary.
Thanks, Janine. Let's pause there for a moment and just take that in. Janine, those are the 5 calamities of Shiva Asarbitamus, the 17th of Tammuz. And now Janine's going to go on and read the 5 on the 9th of Av, 3 weeks later.
On the 9th of Av, it was decreed upon our ancestors that they would all die in the wilderness and not enter Eretz Yisrael. And the temple was destroyed the first time in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, and the second time by the Romans. And Beitar was captured, and the city of Jerusalem was plowed, as a sign that it would never be rebuilt. Not only does one fast on the 9th of Av, but from when the month of Av begins, one decreases acts of rejoicing.
Thank you for reading, Janine.
You're welcome.
So let's take a look at this list again, and then we're going to talk about what surprising things or interesting things we notice about these 2 lists of 5, and what questions they bring up for us. And if you don't want to talk into the recording, you're welcome to place a question or observation in the chat, and I'll read it out. So would anyone like to share anything that you notice or that strikes you about these?
Well, I read through it yesterday and realized how very little I knew or understood about Jewish history. And so I ended up Googling Jewish history timelines and found almost without exception, even the timelines themselves were way too complicated for me to grab a hold of. Too many names in too many places and too many countries or kingdoms or whatever. So I ended up much more confused. But I guess the one thing is it realizing that all this stuff that's on these, as I understand it, all the stuff that's on these 2 lists is mostly post-Torah.
So, okay.
Except the golden calf.
Let's break this down. So this is a great thing to start with. First of all, anyone want to get in Philip's boat and say that they too do not recognize all of the events that are described on this list? Is there anyone who, like Philip? Okay, so everyone is nodding. Nobody here read these lists and thought, oh, I know what all those things are. Now to your next piece, Philip, I wouldn't exactly agree with you. These lists are a really interesting mix of what you could call Torah events and post-Torah events. What you could call, even for the people discussing this in the time of the Mishnah 2,000 years ago, mythical events and historical events, right? So even 2,000 years ago in the Mishnah, the memory of the tablets breaking is what we would call a mythical memory, right? It's not a historical memory, whereas the destruction of the temple or the breach of the walls of the temple, rather, if we're still talking about things happening on Shiva Asarbitamus, those are historical memories. Those are things that are happening in a more historical timeline defined by the people. So in both lists, we have examples of both. For the 17th of Tammuz, the first thing on the list, the breaking of the tablets, that is what is described in Exodus chapter 32, when Moses is up on the mountain receiving revelation and is told that the people have built the golden calf, and he comes down and he destroys the tablets. Similarly, for the 9th of Av, when it says it is decreed that our ancestors would not enter the land and would die in the wilderness, that is in the same year. That is also what is described in the Torah, in the book of Numbers, in Parshat Shlach Lecha, when the Israelites are first commanded to go and take the land, but they are terrified by the spies' report, and so they refuse. And so it is decreed that they will spend another generation wandering in the wilderness. So, on both of these lists, our first item is something that is from the Torah, that is sort of a great archetypal Israelite failure. One, a failure of faith in the form of idolatry. Another, a failure of faith in the form of a refusal to go forward and accept the Israelite destiny, or enact the Israelite destiny as Torah understands Hashem to have commanded it. Continuing on these lists into more historical memories of exile, persecution, military catastrophe. Now, a thing that is interesting, which I at the last minute I cut from my source sheet because I didn't want it to go too long, is that in certain cases we're going to see that that there is a very careful calculation of making sure that we know that these are the dates, and in other cases, and I sort of cut this, the Gemara, the next layer of the text, going through and analyzing this Mishnah, says, Gemara, it's a tradition that this thing happened on this day. Like, we don't have a careful annotated calculation of when this happened. So when you look at the whole of the list, what impressions do we get?
It's sort of interesting that some of the calamities involve, like moral failings on our part, the people's part, and some of them are external calamities.
Yes.
They're all thrown into the same calamity category.
Absolutely. It's a great thing to notice. These are both, we have on this list, not just moments of victimization, but moments of our own moral failing, our collective moral failing, as well as moments of victimization. And I think it's a really interesting spiritual question, what that means, that, sort of retrojecting back into mythic time in these moments of intense moral failing, we then wind up with this time period that seems like sort of cosmically inauspicious for us. This time period when bad things happen to the Jewish people. It's a trajectory. We move through this time period, and I think one of the beautiful ways to see that is by looking at some of the math by which the rabbis calculate this. So let's go ahead on in our text. So in this discussion in the Gemara, in the Talmud of this Mishnah, they ask the question, how do we know? They actually, as I said, they ask the question, how do we know about each of these 10 items? But I'm going to have us sort of zoom into the very first item on the list, that on the 17th of Tammuz, the tablets were broken. So can I have another volunteer to read? Go ahead, Philip.
The Mishnah taught 5 calamitous matters occurred to our forefathers on the 17th of Tammuz, one of which was that the tablets were broken. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive that the tablets were broken on this day? as it is taught in a Baraita, on the 6th of the month of Sivan, the 10 commandments were given to the Jewish people. Rabbi Yossi says it was on the 7th of that month. The Gemara comments, according to the one who said that they were given on the 6th of Sivan, they were given on the 6th. And on the 7th, Moses ascended to Mount Sinai. According to the one who said that the 10 commandments were given on the 7th of Sivan, they were given on the 7th, and on the 7th, Moses ascended to Mount Sinai. As it is written, and he called to Moses on the 7th day out of the midst of the cloud. And it is written, and Moses entered into the midst of the cloud. He went up into the mount, and Moses was on the mount 40 days and 40 nights. The calculation is as follows. There were 24 days remaining in Sivan, plus the first 16 days of Tammuz, which comes to 40 days. On the 17th of Tammuz, Moses descended, came, observed the people worshiping the golden calf, and broke the tablets. And it is written, and it came to pass, as soon as he came near to the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger burned, and he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them beneath the mount.
Thank you for reading, Philip. So we can see this just sort of embedded in the text, this commitment to getting the math to work out. The rabbis really are invested in proving that this event happened on this date. And it becomes part of a larger, very elegant proof that winds up taking us all the way to Yom Kippur, which we see most fleshed out, besides in contemporary literature. You can find like a lot on the Chabad website that does this math for you. But the longest ago source I can find that attempts to do this math is Rashi, the medieval French commentator, commenting back on Exodus, on Moshe's reascension to receive a second set of tablets, taking this math forward. So as we can see, as Rashi lays out, on the 17th of Tammuz, as we just saw in the Gemara's math, the tablets were broken. On the 18th, he, meaning Moshe, burnt the calf and punished the offenders. On the 19th, he ascended the mountain again, as it came to pass on the morrow, that after the day after he had punished the wrongdoers, that Moshe said to the people, "You have sinned a great sin, now I will go up to the Lord." He spent 40 days and sought mercy for the people. Those terminated at the end of Av. There were 11 days from the 19th to the 29th of Tammuz, meaning the days after he broke the tablets, and then 29 days in Av complete the 40. And then he returned to the people. On the first day of the new moon of Elul, it is commanded to him in Exodus 34, be ready in the morning, go up in the morning to Mount Sinai to receive the second tablets. And again, he spent 40 days, of which it is stated in Deuteronomy, I stayed on the mountain according to the first days, 40 days and 40 nights. So he stayed the same period of time. So if we then count from when he goes up on the 1st of Elul, the beginning of the month of repentance, on the 10th of Tishrei is the last day of that second 40-day period. On the 10th of Tishrei, God became reconciled with Israel in joy and perfect atonement and said to Moshe, I have forgiven, and handed over the second set of tablets. When is the 10th of Tishrei? The 10th of Tishrei is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So we see this thread that takes this time period and attempts to make a whole trajectory of sin and redemption lasting, you could say, from the 17th of Tammuz all the way to Yom Kippur. You could even say from Shavuot, from the Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah on the 6th or 7th of Sivan, when the people accept the Torah, but apparently, but as we see in the text, with a great deal of fear and trepidation, to a low point when they build the golden calf and the tablets are shattered, through Av, through this time of atonement and reconciliation until that is all complete on Yom Kippur. And I think this is a very important lens to look at the 3 weeks from. It's not the only lens, but that we see the 3 weeks not as a time of mourning in a vacuum, but as a time of mourning where we are looking not only at what has been done to us, but at our own collective failures, and using that mourning as fuel for the process of atonement that will really become more explicit in the month of Elul and be ideally completed on Yom Kippur. And I think it's important to understand Yom Kippur as a day of the completion of that process, rather than, as so many less observant Jews experience it, as like the day that we pack it all in, right? We beat our chest. This is the day that we acknowledge our wrongdoing and ask for forgiveness and ideally achieve forgiveness. And I think for many people who only observe this on this day, it can be very incongruous because it's actually meant to be the work of an entire season. I'll stop talking there for a moment and invite any of your reflections. Go ahead, Lynn.
In that original reading, the first reading that was done, it said something like joyfulness is reduced at the start of Av. And so that actually surprised me, or maybe confused me. So if the 3 weeks it starts today, we're in Tammuz, and we have a ways to go before it becomes Av, and we're starting this mourning period. What changes on Av that makes it lessening of joy?
Great. So for that, we would go on, and the Gemara itself, the Talmud itself, describes certain practices that we do not take on starting on the month of Av. But I actually turned to the halachic literature because I was very interested in this question. Where does this period of time of the 3 weeks really get discussed? And mostly, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, which is our quintessential medieval halachic code, it discusses from the beginning of Av. And in page or section 551, which is a very long section, it starts discussing the practices that we don't do, or that we do, beginning at the beginning of the month of Av. So when one enters the month of Av, we reduce in joy, and there's this idea that it's an inauspicious time. A Jewish person that has a legal dispute with a Gentile should not try to resolve this dispute during Av. So we see a little bit of superstition there of the idea of Av as an inauspicious time. The gloss of the Ramah Moshe Isserlis, who's the Ashkenazi sort of gloss on the Shulchan Aruch and considered by Ashkenazim as much of an authority as the Shulchan Aruch, that's what's in italics, talks about how we don't wear fancy clothing even on Shabbat from the beginning of Av. And we minimize business transactions or buildings of joy. So this is not a time that you would build a house for your child to get married. It's not a time that you would plant pleasant trees or flowers. It's not a time that we would celebrate engagements or weddings. And the text goes on. I mean, a lot of the practices that we think of as mourning practices, that we basically, it goes on and says basically any behavior that a mourner does or does not do, one should similarly do or not do during the beginning of Av, which actually leads for me the question of, if it all begins at the beginning of Av, what's the significance of the full 3-week period, because in the halachic literature, it actually talks a lot more about just from the beginning of Av on to the 3 weeks. And what I see in the Shulchan Aruch mentioned is near the end of this section, section 17 and 18, they refer to this period of time as Bein HaMitzrim, between the narrow places, which I think is kind of a beautiful poetic reference to it. It's not a good time to celebrate new things by saying Shechianu. Don't buy new clothes and say Shechianu on new clothes. Don't enjoy a new fruit and say a Shechianu on new fruit. There are exceptions. If you've had a new firstborn child and you have to do the ceremony of redeeming the firstborn child, absolutely, you should still say Shechianu for that. And the Ramah adds another note that we might be grateful for, given that blueberry season is coming into full swing right now during this time period. If it's a fruit that is only coming into season during this 3-week period and you won't find it after Tisha B'Av, you can bless it and say Shehechianu Ben HaMitzri. And we have this very tantalizing comment that one should just be careful during this time period. Don't go out alone from the 17th of Tammuz to the 9th of Av, because there is a demon ruling and it's not a good time to hit students. And there's no explanation there. You know, nowadays we might say there's never a good time to hit students, but I think there is this idea that everybody's a little more fragile. Everybody's a little more vulnerable during this time. It's not a good time to take chances. So I believe that it is really mostly minhag. It's mostly a custom that has developed over the centuries to extend those mourning practices that the halachic literature says explicitly not to do from the beginning of Av, all the way back to the 17th of Tammuz. Lynn, does that address your question? Okay. Are there other observations or concerns that folks want to share? Ellen, you're muted.
Maybe you were going to do this later on, and so that's fine. But I would like to hear a little more about I guess you're saying that the grieving, that the purpose of the grieving and the mourning, I can see the part of it that's connected to the calamities that involved our own moral failings, and that the grieving and the mourning is part of that process of reconciliation with God, or, you know, cleaning up our act, finding, you know, connection. But what's the part about the grieving that's connected to the historical stuff where we're victims, and like, what's that about? What does that mean?
It's a great question, you know, and from a traditional source perspective, there are these beautiful pithy lines, you know, one who mourns for Jerusalem will merit to celebrate over Jerusalem rebuilt. But there's not a whole lot that gets at the why of that in the traditional sources. You know, I've come to my own answer, which is so much of our Jewish holiday year, we focus on the triumph over adversity. We focus, I mean, there's that horrible joke that every holiday is they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. And I think there is really some value to taking a segment of the year and saying, we've been through a lot. And practicing looking at it in a non-triumphal way, but in a way that invites us into the grief for all that were lost, all that was lost, in terms of, you know, collectively what it means to have lost our indigeneity and become a diaspora people. That's a huge collective loss, as well as all of the individual lives that were lost, even in the holidays, you know, where we celebrate triumph. So for me, Tisha B'Av and the 3 weeks becomes not just about the destruction of the temple, but about all of the cosmic collective loss that we don't let ourselves mourn the rest of the year. Philip, go ahead.
When I first pondered the list, it seemed to me, for an agricultural culture, how terribly inopportune that all these disasters happen right in the peak of being busy in the fields. But then with this last reading that you just gave us, suddenly that turned on its head, and it's almost like there's a message in there that says, you know, don't be joyful, don't dance, don't go out, get out there in the fields and get busy and keep your head down. So that it almost feels like the way that the 10 catastrophes are thought of fits into the agricultural picture.
Yeah, and I think it fits in a couple ways. It's a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it's really important to notice the agricultural implications of our holiday cycle. First of all, summer is when ancient kings fought wars. Just easier to move armies when things are dry. And you know, even in Tanakh, it mentions like the seasons of kings going out to wars. Summer is also a time of anxiety in a ecological biome that is very similar to ours here in Oregon, because you don't want it to rain, because the ecological the farming cycle, the agricultural cycle, is dependent on a dry period, right? The wheat harvest can be destroyed if it rains too much, just as we noticed like the strawberry harvest not really coming to fruition this year because it rained so late in the season. But also you don't want it to go too long without rain. So it's this very liminal, vulnerable time where we don't want it to rain yet, but we are also scared that it might never rain again. And so for many ancient Near Eastern cultures, we see embedded in the calendar a sort of sense of anxiety at this time of year, because it is the peak agricultural productive time. It is also the time at which the most could go wrong. If the rains come too soon, if they come too late, if they don't come, there's just a lot riding on it. And I think it's no accident, it's no coincidence that, as I said at the beginning of this session, the discussion of these fast days comes in the context of Masachet Ta'anit, the context of the tractate of Talmud that is dealing with the fasts that would be decreed by the Beit Din if we didn't get enough rain. And in some ways, I think these fasts embed into our consciousness that even when everything is going all right, we cannot take for granted that it will continue to do so. Oh, I wonder if anyone else, though, wants to share an answer to Ellen's question. The question being, so what's the value of doing this? What's the value of taking on this cosmic grief on an individual level?
Well, I didn't go there that quickly. I mean, is it in the writings to connect the historical calamities with what we're calling cosmic grief?
Well, it's in the halachic literature to treat this as a time of mourning. And that is based on these 5 calamities on Shiva, Asarbitamus on the 17th of Tammuz, and these 5 on Tishrei B'Av. So, you know, it's directly in the Talmud to say that from the beginning of Av, we reduce in joy, that there is no day as mournful as Tisha B'Av. Commandments about joy, whether they are about feeling joy, increasing joy, reducing joy, are always a little dicey, just because I think it's, you know, there's an acknowledgement that like one's internal state is not that easy to dictate. But as we see it manifest in the halachic literature, that it is possible to dictate, you know, how we walk in the world, how we dress, what we sell, you know, what we celebrate, what we defer celebrating, and all of that is dictated in the halachic literature. So we have someone placing in the chat, individually, I find it really valuable and healing to have a defined space in the year to embrace feelings of grief and sadness, especially because so much of the holiday cycle is focused on joy, and that can be challenging. And I think that's a beautiful insight. And one thing that this list at least invites me to do, and has historically invited Jews to do, is to continue to mythically accumulate grief into this container that is this time period. So you'll see records of, you know, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain being decreed on the 17th of Tammuz and going into effect on the 9th of Av. And I don't know if that's historically accurate, but there is something both terrifying and beautiful about the idea that we can that this time period can hold the historical memory of trauma and be a container for, you know, a safe, explicit amount of time for us to process that trauma. You know, and I think the way that the text flows in the Talmud itself invites that, right? The Talmud, as we started out talking, has this list that ranges from things way back in mythic memory to things in very recent historical memory. When it talks about the city of Beitar being destroyed, that is a destruction that happened in the lifetime memory of rabbis of the Mishnah.
I do really like the idea of a container. That's a very it's a really common metaphor used in therapy, you know, for trauma work, the importance of having a container, that it aids healing to have a container. And, you know, therapists often work very hard with people to create a container before they go into the trauma. So it's really interesting to me to think of it that way. I was going to say more, but I forgot what else I was going to say.
That's okay. Some of you may recall that I've actually used this time to invite people to process. Last year, I used this time to invite people to process grief about COVID. In previous years, I've used this time to invite people to come to grief circles about climate change. I think there is something very powerful about this time period offering us not just a container, but a collective container, or as I've used the phrase a couple times, a cosmic container, right? Where we can take what is on our hearts. And if we're paying attention to the state of the world, I hope there's a lot on our hearts. We can take what's on our hearts and remind ourselves that we're not alone, neither in space nor in time, in our grief and our rage and our shame. There's, as we've discussed, there's shame here as well that we need to work through. Does anyone else want to share how you are moved to relate to this time, or how you could imagine relating to this time, or how you resist relating to this time?
I'll say what you just said was really helpful, because I've been wondering how to bring it. How does one utilize this time? And, talking about COVID, climate change, and I have to look at the past year and see what to bring to this time. So that's really helpful.
Right. I mean, look, let's put it another way. There's time embedded into our year cycle that maybe we're a little more used to using, where we take stock of what has been in gratitude, right? Sukkot is a harvest festival. We take stock of, like, we made it through the harvest season and now we have this beautiful harvest, and thank God. There's times throughout the year cycle for taking stock in gratitude. And I think it is equally beneficial to us to have a time in the year to take stock in grief, to notice what has been so hard, what are we mourning, what do we need to lament, and to recite lamentations, whether that is the traditional book of lamentations that we do recite on Tisha B'Av itself, or the lamentations of our own heart and our own moment.
That metaphor, taking stock, did you say taking stock of grief?
I said taking stock in gratitude and taking stock in grief.
I mean, I bristle with that metaphor for some reason. Like, I attend to makes sense to me. Attune to. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. It's related to, like, accounts, accountability, keeping accounts, which has its good and bad aspects.
Yes. And I think there is an aspect of this time period that, if we look at the traditional language of lamentation and of the keynote, the hymns of lament that are composed for this time period, that is not just about our own, like, cheshbon hanefesh, our own accounting of the soul that we talk about on the high holidays, but could also refer to this time period as well, but also about calling God to account. Like, many of the traditional laments are extremely explicit in saying to God, you have failed us. You have broken the covenant. You owe us. Do better, God. And I think there is this way that, for various reasons, both secular and traditional and everywhere in between, Jews nowadays are a little less comfortable raging at God. But if we look at the traditional liturgies of Tisha B'Av, there is room for that, for that sense of taking stock. Lynn, go ahead.
Maybe I'm changing the topic maybe a little bit, but I've been thinking about what you were saying. Well, all of us, I think, about vulnerability and like fragility at this time of year. And some might say that the winter season is more challenging for humans. But I personally, for me, the summer is the hardest. And as I was getting ready, knowing I was planning to attend this session today, I heard on the news or from some people on the East Coast that there's this, a lot of very high heat, high temperatures happening in so many parts of the country this coming week. And thinking about how people I know, people I'm related to, feel vulnerable and compromised when the heat gets that hot for so long. And, you know, even this container here of being on a study group talking about this time in Jewish history, I'm here because it is a very contemporary issue. You did mention the climate change and, you know, opportunities to discuss and feel and share in community how we feel vulnerable at this time of year. So it's very valuable to me to have that communal experience. I hope some of that made sense.
It does. Some of you know I'm recovering slowly from COVID right now. And it's been like infuriating to have COVID during the summer. And I was thinking about that going into the 3 weeks and sort of noticing I both try to observe the 3 weeks in a spiritual way, and I also struggle with it because I have such high ambitions for this time of year for myself. I want to get outside every day, and I want to take my daughters to rivers and lakes, and I want to take them berry picking, and I want to do lots of canning, and it's just potentially a very productive time in many senses of the word, as well as this time of vulnerability in a way that we're more aware of, especially after the heat waves and wildfires of recent summers. And the body is always vulnerable. Yes, Philip.
Now, I wanted to ask real quickly, just because I don't know, for us, winter is the harshest season, but in Israel, is summer or winter a harsher season?
It depends where you are, because, as I said, it's actually a very similar climate to Western Oregon. So up in the hills, you know, Jerusalem, the winters can be very cold and chilling and rainy and unpleasant. Like here in the farming valleys, summer definitely feels brutal. But it varies year by year, as it does here, in terms of the severity, the relative severities of winters and summers. Yes, Ellen.
Could you talk a little bit about how, I mean, I'm I'm sure my ignorance will show here, but so when you talked about, you know, canning and picking berries and taking your daughters to the river, like that all sounds very joyous.
Mm-hmm.
So just from a very simple, I don't get it. How, like, I mean, yeah, that seems like that's what we should be doing, is living in joy, especially for children. So so just make sense of that to me with the 3 weeks.
I don't know that there's making sense of it. It's a tension. It's an incongruity. I think it's like felt even more so by friends of mine who I think about like, I recall Nina mentioning in the past, like it's always weird for her when Shiva Asarbitamus happens before country fair, and country fair is during the 3 weeks. So there are certain practices that I'm careful not to do, like go to live music concerts during this time. Like there are certain sort of halachic commitments that I keep during this time. I don't get a haircut during this time either, but like I only cut my hair every other year anyway, so it's not as big a deal. And I try to use these fasts today and on Tisha B'Av as a reminder to go to the grief as it arises. So that I'm not choosing between, you know, doing nice summer things for my daughters and feeling grief, but I'm giving myself permission to feel the personal and cosmic grief and not push it away as it arises. Yeah. And then as once the 1st of Av comes, we'll follow more practice. I mean, it's sort of weird because there a lot of the traditional practices are things that my family doesn't do that much of anyway. We don't eat that much meat, so it's not a huge deal for us to be mindfully not eating meat that week. But we don't eat meat that week, and I think there's, in a community where lots of people are observing this time, there's also more reinforcement. And I've struggled in the years I've been here with, you know, how much to push, what sorts of containers to offer to encourage people to use this time, because I think it is useful. I think it's a really good time to have like a grief chevruta, so to speak, right? To like find a buddy who wants to be mindfully using this time as well, and check in with each other and hear each other's sadness.
It also does take on more value in my mind when I think about, you know, the kind of push in American culture towards, you know, making everything light and happy and glossing over stuff.
Yeah. This is not a time for fixing, which doesn't mean that we couldn't have activist commitments during this time, but you know, we look for the silver linings of things. We talk ourselves out of our grief, and this is not a time for talking ourselves out of our grief. I want to share this. I found this beautiful teaching from Dr. Erica Brown talking about the value of the 3 weeks. Would someone like to read?
I'll read it. Suffering humanizes us. Ignoring suffering dehumanizes us. I don't want to ruin my good mood by looking at that homeless person, so I turn away. And with that turning, I let go of my social responsibility to him or her. Attunement to suffering makes us more compassionate. It also helps us appreciate where we come from and all that it took to get us where we are. We have to remind ourselves that we don't diminish our happiness when we spend a day or a few weeks meditating on the tragedies of history from which we emerged. We become more grateful, holding on tightly to our blessed lives because we can.
If you need a reminder that feeling the pain can actually have spiritual reward. And it is important to go through this process. As we've said, it is contained, it's a few weeks. And on the other side, we get to the 15th of Tu B'Av, which is a day of joy. And I think one thing that's fascinating is later in Masechet Ta'anit, we see that Tu B'Av is compared as joyous a day for the Israelite people, for the Jewish people, as Yom Kippur. And I love that those 2 days are named and juxtaposed as the 2 most joyous holidays of the year. Going on in the discussion, I didn't include this part, but another rabbi sort of says, well, I get why Yom Kippur is obviously the most joyful day of the year, but why is Tu B'Av so joyful? And I think it sometimes feels incongruous for many of us to think of Yom Kippur as a day of joy. But if we think of it in terms of this trajectory of Yom Kippur as the culminating day of reconciliation and forgiveness and clean slate after a lot of spiritual work, then it makes a lot of sense to think of it as a day of joy. And Tu B'Av as this like mini day of joy after getting through Tisha B'Av, when we are able to let go of the grief and literally start dancing again. I mean, in the Talmud, it is described as a day when people would go out dancing and start getting engaged and getting married again. It's a day when people would choose partners. So our time is winding to a close, but I hope that this has been of value, or just that the notion of having time that is for grief, for our individual griefs, for our collective griefs, for our shame, for raging at all that has happened and not needing to talk ourselves out of that. I hope that is of value for us. And I hope that if you find yourself feeling any of those less comfortable emotions during these 3 weeks, you'll remember that you're not alone, neither in space nor in time. And that's what this time is for. We'll be observing Tisha B'Av on Saturday night, August 6th, and breaking the fast together on Sunday night, August 7th, for those who would like to join. And I've scheduled my concert of sabbatical compositions on Thursday night, August 11th, in honor of Tu B'Av, in honor of coming out of mourning and making music together. So hope to continue this trajectory of observance with some of you. And thank you for learning together today.